Well, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is another podcast on history, morality, and ethics in the 19th century American West, Red Dead Redemption 2. So this week, your required reading, if you're an undergraduate, was Chapter 3 from our Richardson text, and Chapters 11 and 12 on Kantian ethics in the Schaeffer-Landau text. If you're a graduate student or ambitious or just needed something else to read, we have Greg Grandin's The End of the Myth, Kant's a selection from Kant called The Good and Will and the Categorical Imperative, and a piece by Honora O'Neill, who is a British philosopher, on Kantian ethics. So that's what we're talking about this week. In terms of the game, we think that by this point you should be getting at least close to the beginning, close to Chapter 3. So if you're still on Horseshoe Overlook, I think is what it's called, then that eventually Chapter 3 forces you to move and relocate. And so, you're going to have some missions with Dutch and with Javier, with Lenny. You're going to go rescue Sean, do a bunch of stuff. The last couple of missions that will tell you that you're getting close are the missions with John Marston. So he tells you about, his plan to rob a train. You got to go get the wagon with the oil drum in it. Then you rob the train. And then he says that he's going to go into town and set something up. That mission, once you complete it, will basically be, and then you've got to talk to Dutch at camp and you guys move, and that's the start of Chapter 3. So if you're not quite there, we would say just kind of try to be approaching that and getting close to it as we go. So,
all right, so for Richardson, Chapter 3, not a lot of comments this time around. We're setting up that post towards the end of the 1860s going into the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where for Americans, in the sense that there's emancipated people of African descent, there's this fear that the federal government's going to favor them. And this is not only in the South but also in the North. And this goes back to Richardson's argument about sort of this this emerging middle class ideal, and an important part of this is emancipated freemen who, in the South during Reconstruction, fall under sort of this the protection of the federal government, and for both the South, who are trying to fight against it, but also in the North with this middle class ideal, seeing that newly freed African Americans are unfairly taking advantage of the system. The other part of this too is the rise of big business, which we do get to see in the game, right? In terms of the antagonist, and we
Leviticus Cornwall.
Yeah, we can think of this in the sense of railroads, being the earliest form of a big business that is national in scope. Right, debt dependent upon the telegraph. Right, I think there's a lot of things clicking into place in terms of capital accumulated during the war. Right, financiers are investing in railroads, and you're able to use the new technology. The other part too is and this is when we think of like steel companies. This is the moment that steel companies, because you have these tariffs that are in place, right? So the Republican Party enacts these tariffs that keep cheap British steel out. But the stimulation of the railroads also stimulates the development and production of steel making in the United States. And so that is a huge bonus for steel companies, because railroads are going in wherever these investors are investing in railroads. So this is stimulating the steel industry at the same time. The other part of this is the arrival of sort of unskilled labor, but also clerical workers and bankers and managers, bureaucracy. So yeah. Railroads develop a form of bureaucracy that often is incorporated into sort of government functions too as the 1800s go on. More women are gaining education. I think we do get a glimpse of this in once we get further east in the game. Mm-hmm. The other part is this idea that from the Southern perspective and sort of this anti-federal sentiment, right? They're charging that African Americans are revolutionaries intent on confiscating the region's wealth and property. So newly emancipated freemen are now suddenly this threat to the region's wealth and property. Again, this isn't necessarily the reality, but this is more of a rhetorical trying to get that, the middle class in the North to be on their side in this, newly forming post-Civil War national political tug of war.
Yeah. And one of the things I think that is interesting here is if we think about our first chapter on our Kant reading, one of the things that is focused on there is this idea that, my universal principles should be, my moral principles should be like universal. It should apply to everyone. And one way to think about what the Southerners are charging, right, is that some people are being treated unfairly. They're getting more opportunities than they should, right, or than is appropriate for them. Or they're taking advantage of the system in ways that us, good old Southerners or whatever are not, right? And so this is one way as an entry point into thinking about this first sort of part of the Kantian thesis, which is the idea that, I should have these concept of these categorical imperatives, which are, our moral commands that don't depend on what we want or any antecedent desires or anything like that. They're just supposed to always sort of hold for us. And the way that's phrased in Kant, at least in the English translation, is act only on that maxim that you can at the same time will it be a universal law. So that's a really confusing way to basically say a maxim is a principle for action, and I should only act on it if it's universalizable, if I can expect anyone else to, right? And the real focus there is the idea that, consistency and fairness and justice are served by treating people equally. And one way to, again, true or not, right, and we have reason to think it's not true, the ways the Southerners were talking about this, were trying to get the middle class on their side, suggested these people, these special interests, women who are maybe trying to get suffrage, right, or newly freed African people who are trying to, not just be sharecroppers or not, but actually amass some wealth, right, accumulate some wealth on their own, that they're somehow doing something unfair. They're not being treated the same way, right? There's some kind of unfairness. And really, even in this initial setup from Richardson, the idea of the middle class is the idea that everyone's already on an even playing field, and if we just cooperate and do well, then things will go well. And there's almost like a rejection of the idea that people don't start at the same place. And thus, when you have, these special interests, quote unquote, well, they're asking for more than, say, the people in the middle class or something, right? And so one way to think about this sort of first chapter of Kant that focus on the universalizability form of the categorical imperative is to think about, whether people are being treated fairly. Are the same things extending to everyone, right? And that's a way to think about, a Kantian ethic. One of them is we want to prevent nepotism. We want to prevent partiality, which we see a lot of in lots of parts of life. Or you sometimes will see people that treat themselves as the exception, right? So, abortion is never right, except in my case. I had to do it, or whatever it is, right? And so lots of immorality comes from making an exception for yourself. And the kind of Kantian insight here is, if I have some moral rule, it should be able to be applied to everyone, including me. I can't make myself the exception for it, right? And there are attractions to that. The Schaefer-Landau notes. I think the best is that sort of consistency and fairness, because that is deeply intuitive to us. When people are treated differently without a relevant reason, we find that really upsetting. And certainly that is what is happening at this point in history. And kind of on the opposite side, it's certainly how lots of people in the South are perceiving, right, what's going on and what's happening. And I'm not going to go over all the problems that Schaefer-Landau notes. Please pay attention to those. There are issues with universalizability. There's an issue about how, if I have absolute moral duties, when they conflict, which one do I do? But I think the thing that's really interesting here is to think about the dark side of integrity. So, if I am true to my principles, that's only as good as my principles, right? So if I am, as Schaefer-Landau notes, like a Nazi with integrity, that just really means bad news, because I'm going to hold to those principles even in extreme situations, but the principles are going to guide me to something deeply immoral. And in fact, the other chapter on Kant maybe gives us a way to constrain the universalizability and a way to prevent some of the worst abuses of this idea of integrity. We value people who are loyal to their own beliefs, who are consistent, who don't just sort of change at the drop of a hat. But that kind of integrity, which it often is so admirable, can be really harmful and destructive if it's a person who has integrity with a kind of deeply corrupt moral code. So,
yeah, and it's interesting too. Is we were talking earlier about the Kant dies in 1804.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Like, so these ideas are sort of unleashed during the founding of the United States.
Yeah.
And then you have a few generations of Americans, and so by the time you get to this post-war period, it's interesting to think that 200 years before, would there be some sense that the government itself is favoring one group over another, or would that be the natural way of things? So think of you're in France and you have the church. The church is going to be treated a certain way by the king.
Yes.
Or you have even the bourgeoisie versus peasants.
Yeah.
And there isn't necessarily a question.
Or something. Yeah.
But in the wake of these Enlightenment revolutions, right? The American Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, all of a sudden these ideas of rights are circulating. And I think that when we think of ideas of race and how race, really escalates after slavery, right? Because slavery is inherited by a young nation that has a certain normalization of slavery. You might be against slavery, but it's not necessarily this kind of foreign thing.
Yeah.
But the moment slavery's gone, you've just removed a quote, naturalized hierarchy, which then forces, if you're going to retain certain power relations, it forces the elevation of ideas that pertain to race, which play into sort of the middle class that we're all on the same playing field, which you're not, but you need to believe that, or else the whole thing collapses in your head.
Yeah.
And so, but then that forms a tension with actual policies of there's newly freed people. They do not have capital. There is no reparations.
Yep.
And so no
40 acres and a mule.
Yeah. Whatever is going to happen is going to be this very, the most public education, right? There's not going to be a lot of capital put behind helping people out that are newly freed.
Yeah.
But even that slight help is seen as some oppression towards,
as deeply objectionable.
People that, and then we'll get this towards the end, people that are deemed to be in the moral community. And so it's interesting to see Kant's ideas really can't exist, centuries before, in the way that you could imagine that this group of people here, 1860s going into the 1870s, see the world intuitively.
Sure.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's a really good point, Dan. And I think, one way to think about this is we don't always, there's this British philosopher named Mary Midgley, and she kind of talks about philosophy like plumbing. And what she says is it's kind of like, in your day-to-day life, you probably never think about plumbing. And the only time you really do think about it is when it goes wrong, right? And that's when you're like, oh, crap, my sink won't stop flowing. Now I need to call somebody. Otherwise, it's below the surface. Don't even think about it, right? Yeah. And, she gives the example in this paper in the late 20th century of social contract theory as a thing that we all just kind of assume, but then maybe is not the best way to think about relationships between people and stuff, right? So in a similar way, these people, 1860s and stuff, probably have, just kind of, assumed or incorporated or whatever various ideas from earlier periods about the rightful place of people and rightful interaction and stuff, even without really thinking carefully about it.
Yeah,
right? No, that's really good. Okay, sorry.
So the other part too, and this actually works, from the perspective of the South, where Northerners, begin to shrink away from radical Republicans, and they see sort of this military occupation, Reconstruction, as a waste of taxpayer money, right? And the idea that they're buying votes. Right. So this a part of this sentiment that again kind of is ridiculous when we look at the historical record, but in the moment where you're just reading these newspapers that
Mm-hmm.
are very decentralized. It might make sense to you if you're in Indiana or like Pennsylvania and you just don't know what's actually going on in the South, but you're suspicious of sort of the Republican Party that while it's home to labor, it's also home to this rising big business
Yeah.
group that often intrudes upon local communities that sort of existed on a smaller scale of business.
Yeah,
Um,
this is a thing that I have found as I've been reading this stuff and kind of like, learning from you as we talk is I always kind of thought that the old Republican and Democratic Party were just basically mirror images of what they are now, right? And, reading through this and thinking about it is, obviously that is not quite true. Things are a little more weirdly complicated and conjoined in ways that I wouldn't expect based on if I just thought they were the inversion of what they are now or something.
yeah. Um, the other part too, right? You have the rise of the Klan. I think that's sort of the history of that comes right after the Civil War, 65, 66. I think it's 66. It's formed in Tennessee.
Hmm.
I have to look it up. But it becomes this arm of politics, or it's the paramilitary arm for Southern politics. It's going after African Americans, but it's also going after sort of white Republicans that are trying to mobilize Republican votes in the South. There's a bunch of things happening. In the North, you have an increasingly restless labor movement, right? Because you have this explosion of big business. Think again, with the explosion of railroads, you have a steel industry that's cranking out, that's producing steel, so they need more people to work.
Mm-hmm.
So you have that element, and then you also have this moment where Republicans then go after the Klan because they don't want the Klan interfering with elections that might sway towards the Democratic side. But the very idea of going after the Klan backfires because then everyone thinks that, oh, you're doing that because you want Republicans to win in the South.
Yeah.
And it plays into the language that the Southern Democrats were already painting about the Republican Party in the North.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's sort of, there's these weird momentums happening that aren't necessarily built on facts, but there's a perceived sentiment that's very much driving national politics.
Yeah.
And then she ends on this element about the West. And again, the West has this different relationship between North-South and sort of the West and arguably the North, but the West and the East. And it's, the irony of the West is, it's distant from government power, DC, but government intervention is crucial for its development.
Yeah. Yeah. It needs funding and infrastructure and funneling of resources and guarantees about private investors that they won't lose the money that they're willing to put forward. And
and they're paying for, indigenous removal from areas, reservations, or reservations that were agreed upon, and then suddenly some gold is found, so they need the federal government to intervene again. So it's definitely from a white Westerner point of view is government will pay for all the costs of doing the West.
Yeah.
You'll just build your your cabin and plant some crops and tend to the cattle. The rest of the infrastructure will just fall into place.
Yeah.
Right. And again, it's sort of, that's the rugged individualist West built upon the
privatize the profits and socialize the losses.
Or it's just the infrastructure. Like without the infrastructure, if you're in the West and you have cattle, like
good luck.
Yeah, it's John Wayne's Red River, right, where you're running the cattle north to, I think they go to Dodge City, instead of rails that you can load cattle on it.
Well, and that was a thing I thought was also kind of interesting. I can't remember now if it was in the last chapter or this most recent one about how the price that you got for cattle was so different in different parts, and that's why you had these cattle runs going from, parts of the South up to right, these areas where they're paying a lot more for cattle and stuff, and it was thus reasonable for you to do it.
I mean that ties into the telegraph, right? Like the telegraph equalizes markets, but it also extends markets into areas that previously weren't affected.
Yeah.
Right. I always use if you teach early 1800s, you have to talk about the market revolution, and really that is, you have places in Pennsylvania that aren't necessarily affected with the market mechanisms of the East Coast.
Sure.
But the moment that these, this infrastructure ties in they used to be remote areas. Now all of a sudden, right, that cart full of apples that you've always picked to sell at market, suddenly they could drop in price for no reason whatsoever. And if, macroeconomics hasn't been invented yet, so for all you know, the person's just ripping you off.
Yeah.
But they have to pay what the market says.
Yeah.
And that creates, right, again, that conflict. It disrupts communities, and that happens over and over as you move west.
Yeah.
Arguably, it's a part of, it's the contradiction of, the Western entrepreneur suspicious of big business. Until they get to be big business, right? Yeah. Like it's the ranchers up in Wyoming. The Johnson County War, which really is very much like Red Dead has a version of that in the epilogue. So if you get to the epilogue, you get to kind of get a glimpse of the Johnson County War where it was like very investment ranching, right? When you read about it, it's very like, oh my God, this just happened, but it's 1890s.
Oh,
but it's sort of big money investment in cattle. And they're going after these smaller cattle ranches.
I see.
Right. And I keep wanting, I need to watch Yellowstone. Like I need to get through Yellowstone.
Sure. Yeah,
but I suspect that Yellowstone is playing off
that kind of.
Yeah, it's sort of small scale ranch versus big scale, or around here.
Agriculture kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think around Kansas is, there's the corporate farm versus the family farm.
Yes.
Right. One is within the moral community. The other is outside the moral community.
Yeah. We don't look kindly on one.
But the family farm is within capitalism, right? Like it's so it's part of those contradictions that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other part, I think, when you get into Greg Grandin's book, he does have this really good chapter on the safety valve, right? And this is situated within the Jacksonian democracy, right? But I think the idea of the safety valve is really interesting because, it becomes literally it's the out. If you're in the East, you've a couple generations in the East, not really going anywhere, or you just recently arrived from, overseas, migrating or immigrating to the United States. You are trying to get out of that, and that safety valve is the West, right? There are indigenous groups there, but again, from your perspective, you have the right to that land, right? And again, there's that the scope of the moral community.
Yep.
These people are in the way.
They will not be in the moral community, or they will be there much lower.
Yeah, there's a really good quote. It's the uncomfortable. So there's some very uncomfortable quotes from John Wayne, but in an interview, it's the famous Playboy interview from 1971. But and I like it not because I agree with it, but it's perfectly John Wayne, but also John Wayne as a symbol.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
representative.
It's very much like, it's not Marion Morrison. It is John Wayne, right? John Wayne, if anyone knows, I think Marion Morrison is his real name. And as he said, that wasn't American enough, so they named me John Wayne, the studio. And so that became his Americanized name.
Actually, I did not know that.
It's an amazing story.
That's phenomenal.
That's great. But he says, in this, he answers this question about, Native Americans, and he says, I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from them, if that's what you're asking. Because I think the interviewer is the interview is kind of poking at him because it's also in that during the Vietnam War protests and towards the end of it. But our so-called stealing of this country from them was just a matter of survival. There were great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. Right.
Wow.
And again, it's like that's kind of sums up these attitudes. Yeah. So you could feel bad, right, from the East. I think people in the West who are in direct contact have more of the we need to exterminate them.
Yeah.
But sort of respectable opinion.
The ones that are subject sometimes to these violent raids.
Yes, yeah, things, right? and they're more.
In the East, you're entirely kind of isolated from it, and so
And you're reading stories, and it's romantic, it's John Wayne definitely has this, explains the inner culture that's contradictory, but it's like, oh, there you go, right? There's but that's a part of that safety valve, right? Like, there's land out there, and this group's being selfish, and they deserve to be removed. Mm-hmm. Plus, they're not right. I think you said this one or two episodes back, but they're not using it right.
Yeah.
Right. They're not raising cattle. They're not visibly planting crops.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's like a list of sort of these excuses.
Yeah.
And that they're outside the scope of the moral community.
Absolutely.
What was the other? The last thing I think. I mean, if you're going to read Grandin, get through it. Grandin's book is. I mean, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author.
Okay.
I mean, he writes for trade press. He's a historian.
Yeah.
But every book he writes is just readable, fantastic. You're flying through it.
Excellent.
But he talks about the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bureau, and I think we'll probably get into that more next week in Richardson. But the Freedmen's Bureau is a part of Reconstruction, and it's the bureaucracy that's trying to help rebuild the South, but also it's like an aid organization for newly emancipated people of African descent, but it's also for impoverished whites, right? So there's this effort to build schools.
Yeah.
The idea that you're going to build these public schools, obviously they're segregated, so it's not like that's right. Yeah. But it's the idea that you're going to educate this population. Yeah. But again, this sort of, I guess what we call them dog whistle sort of things today. And he brings up this idea, right? Like, just as today, and he wrote this in 19, when simply mentioning a topic, and he kind of has Obamacare, for example, can call forth a whole racialized worldview whose details needn't be filled in. Yeah. Right? So the same way that works, the phrase Freedmen's Bureau alone whistled its meaning. Right. Most of Andrew Johnson, Johnson's northern and southern audiences had been raised in the church of Andrew Jackson's, quote, primitive simplicity and purity, end quote, with its already racialized understanding of the federal government, when any publicly administered social program would be seen as but an opening for a, quote, extraneous corrupting influences. Right. And so what Freedmen's Bureau becomes is just, it's a way to critique the federal government, but it's a racialized critique. Yeah. Right. So it's when you say Freedmen's Bureau,
it's like a combination of government overreach plus
they're helping African Americans, and that is unfair. Yeah. Right. Or in fact, that's oppression against sort of the white population, and that's from the Southern political perspective, that is that's their rhetorical strategy to get that middle class. Back on the side, because you also, you're trying to get them to forget about the Civil War. Yeah. And so, and that helps to modernize these political parties as well, right? And race doesn't keep going because slavery ends just because. Race becomes a very important tool for reimagining political parties, but also reimagining social policies. Yeah. And then also, but the scope of the moral community in that more philosophical sense.
Yeah. So So I was just when you talk about the Freedmen's Bureau, I just thought I would raise something. I want to say it's been less than maybe 8 years, 5 to 8 years. Yeah, probably I don't know 7, something like that. When I found out about like the Freedmen's Bank and all of that, like I just didn't know anything about that. Mm-hmm. Then you read about it. It's like it was a bank that, right? Like when these freedmen would accumulate money. They often, like other banks, were like, we don't want to hold your money. We don't want to take it. Plus, there's like distrust and stuff. Yeah. So you get the Freedmen's Bank, and they're like, yeah, we'll take it, right? We will hold your money. It will be a way for you to accumulate wealth and stuff. And then through a series of mismanagement, mishaps, and maybe just malice, I don't remember the history of it, but it eventually just like goes under, and most people don't recover all of their savings. Yeah. And that was like, even at that time, it's like millions of dollars that would have been the wealth of these people. And most of them recovered very little, if any of it. Yeah. And so that's just another thing to know and think about in this context, which I did not know existed or was a thing until like 5 to 8 years ago. I was doing research on some other topic and that came up and I was like, what is this? And kind of went on a little rabbit hole of it, right? Yeah. And
there's that, like, because could you get away with that if it was sort of a white middle class? Yeah. Like they would burn down the bank. Yeah. But in this case, it's... this group that we're taking money from is outside the scope of the moral community. That's right. Yeah. So you know what? We can engage in this corruption, which those are the things that the South would really highlight. Mm-hmm. Right? This is corrupt. The whole thing's corrupt. Yeah. It's a waste of money. Exactly. Hey, middle class in the North, they're wasting your taxpayer money.
That's right. Yeah, wasting taxpayer dollars. So. Well, the topic of not only slavery but the scope of the moral community, I think, really is it's a good case to illustrate the sort of second chapter on Kant, which is this other really important part of Kant. That second chapter focused on the idea of what scholars call the humanity form of the categorical imperative versus the universalizability form, which was chapter 11, and Kant thought. Weirdly, Kant thought those were two identical claims that are just phrased differently. And most people now think there's no way to make the universalizability thing be logically equivalent to the humanity thing. They're just talking about different things, right? So the humanity form of the categorical imperative is we should always treat humanity as an end in itself instead of as a mere means to an end. So we want to think about this in the context of instrumental versus intrinsic value, or ends and means, right? So if I'm writing on a piece of paper with a pen, that's a means to an end, right? I'm using a tool that allows me to get some other good, which in this case maybe is writing a note or indicating where I want to stop in my discussion or whatever, right? But its value is it's instrumentally valuable, right? I'm using it to get to some good state. So when my pen runs out, I'm just going to get another pen because its use as a tool has been exhausted and I'm done with it, right? And what Kant thought is that human beings, and really the humanity, which for Kant was really wrapped up in rationality, right? That is what makes us distinct from other things. That's what allows us to have dignity. That's what allows us to comprehend the categorical imperative is our rationality. And so for Kant, that's also what allows our autonomy. Right? We have this sort of freedom because hopefully we recognize others as ends and we treat them that way, but we recognize that in ourselves, right? We think of ourselves as a source of some kind of incomparable value that we would find it really objectionable if other people used us like a tool for their own purpose, right? And so, the connection here with slavery is quite obvious, right? I mean, this is a case where people are literally being used for some other purpose, which in this case is to accumulate wealth or for their labor or, for their children as a continued source of labor or all of these things, right? And I think that, the thing to think about for the second part of Kant is, it's kind of supposed to be complementary. Most of our textbook, like for example, next week we're doing consequentialism. Your first chapter is going to be, here's all the good stuff about consequentialism. Here's kind of Schaefer-Landau cheerleading for consequentialism or propping it up or saying, here's why it's attractive, here's why it's intuitive, here are the benefits it has, advantages it has. And then the second chapter is like, okay, now you've got the good stuff. Here's the bad stuff about consequentialism, right? It's like, what are the problems and what are the objections and what doesn't it work well with or whatever, right? The con chapters, even though we're starting with it in a certain way, it's a little weird because, as you noted, they're kind of just like both combined. They both say, here's some good things about universalizability or focus on intention or duties to others. And then here's some bad aspects of that, right? Or here's this good focus on autonomy. And then here's some things that are unanswered or problems or issues or whatever, right? And so, I think there are lots of really attractive parts of this idea of humanity. If you've ever worked in food service or other kind of service industries, sometimes people, right, customers will treat you like you're just kind of an extension of the building. You often feel very dehumanized if you do that kind of work. And it's because people are kind of treating you as a mere means to an end. You're just a tool. You're a food delivery robot or something like that for them, right? So there are a lot of these attractions of autonomy, right? I mean, it helps us understand why we might oppose some of these really egregious actions like slavery, because it removes or strips the autonomy from a person. It also does not recognize their humanity, right, as something that is intrinsically valuable in and of itself, as an end in itself, as opposed to a means or something instrumentally valuable. It also explains our kind of outrage at paternalism. When someone else tells us, here's what you're going to do, we bridle at that, right? And part of that is maybe because we're American, we're individualists. But lots of human beings have that kind of response, that negative response to that. And there's other things that could ground universal human rights. You might think it explains certain kinds of appropriate attitudes about punishment, etc. But there are various problems with it. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to save our discussion of free will because we'll actually have a whole week on that, and we'll get to talk about that here in the podcast. But obviously Kant assumes a pretty robust conception of free will, and this is there's a great deal of philosophical controversy over that, of whether we have it and what it would actually mean for us to have it. Probably one of the biggest difficulties for Kant, or at least people that find this view objectionable, is the scope of the moral community, as Dr. McClure alluded to a couple times. So, the basic idea of the moral community is who has what we might call minimal moral status, and then we can think about full moral status if there's a difference there, right? And in virtue of what do they have it? And you'll notice that Schaefer-Landau comes back to this over and over again in all of these ethical theories, because they all say slightly different things. So on Kant's view, the thing that makes you and I as human beings sources of dignity, sources of sort of incomparable, infinite value is our humanity. But what is distinctive about the humanity is rationality. For Kant, it's like our rational nature. And so, insofar as you have less of that rational nature, or people think you have less of that rational nature, Kant's going to say you have lesser of that status of humanity, and thus you're maybe not a full part of the moral community. And so when we think of the scope of the moral community, on a Kantian view, animals, for the most part, and part of this is Kant not understanding how animals can reason, and part of it is just the high bar of rationality setting, is animals are basically going to be out. So you could, if you damage an animal, if it's someone else's property, if it's their domestic, if there's a livestock animal or their domestic animal like a cat or a dog, right? Well, then you may have done some wrong to them by damaging their property, but you haven't wronged the animal because the animal, being not rational, not part of the moral community, right? Can't be wronged. Another way that this is used, of course, and this happened in Kant's time, right? In some sense I don't want to say fully with Kant's support because it's a little messy, but right, Kant explicitly in his writing says slavery is a good example of how you cannot own another person and treat them as an end in themselves, right? It is also true that Kant was, one of the, if not sort of the main founder of this kind of scientific racism, which is this idea that I'm going to sort of figure out, when I think about all human beings, I, of course, as children of the Enlightenment, we want to think about what all of them have in common, but also how are they different and to what extent are they different? And Kant also says this about, I'm pretty sure Kant says about women that they are not fully rational, and that's part of why maybe it's justified to treat them differently. But certainly Kant says this about, Europeans and, Caucasoids, Caucasians, white people, is that they're the ones that have the highest sort of level of humanity and culture. And then in various other ways, he thinks other races just don't, right? They don't meet as much of that. And so he says, in fact, that, the people of Africa are natural slaves. They have so little ability to reason or direct themselves that it's natural and fitting that someone else direct them in labor or something like that, right? the reason I'm suggesting there's a tension there is, of course, by Kant's own lights of his own theory, and he gives the example of slavery and says that it was never something that would be appropriate as a way to treat another human being, and that's obviously not consistent, right, straightforwardly, with his remarks on African people, right? And, you know, there's maybe some reason to think that Kant's attitudes about this shifted over time, although that itself is pretty complicated and there's scholarly disagreement about the extent of it and what it really means. You have these later works of Kant where he's saying, like, slavery is actually harmful, it is not a good practice, we shouldn't be doing it. And in fact, saying that, like, colonialism is a problem, that Europe keeps going into these countries and taking stuff and saying, here's how you should live, is something that is not good for them, right? I mean, Kant specifically says, like, that China and Japan, who, you know, famously at this time basically did not allow entry to foreigners or were highly restrictive of it, he basically said they have the right idea, because if they let us in, they know what's going to happen. We're going to try to take it over, and then we're going to try to change their culture and do all of this stuff, right? And that is, you know, not necessarily a popular attitude at this time. It certainly doesn't mean that Kant was an abolitionist about slavery, right? And there's no question that, you know, he did have these views about sort of what you might think of as like the metaphysics of racial partitions that justify differential treatment, differential ethical treatment from these people. But it does seem like, you know, I mean, I think I at least look back sometimes on people, and I think, like, these people that were so insightful about these particular things, and how could they not see how it applied to this thing, right? And part of that just might be we all have blind spots, right? I often wonder, like, what are people in the future going to think about us? In the same way we look back and these things that were really normalized at a time, not that no one ever disagreed at a time, right? You have abolitionist groups and other people are like, this is wrong. But by and large, people are like, this is just the way things are and it's okay and everything. It's interesting to think, what will people in 50, 60, 100 years think about what we're doing? And what will they isolate as things that to us are very normal, unexceptionable, morally permissible, and they'll be like, oh my God, or something, right? Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, like, I mean, Kant thinking about, like, you know, his racialized ideas and Africans, you know, not being I think that permeated elite thinking, let alone going further down. You know, the famous, like, the Jefferson, you know, notes on the state of Virginia. That's where he has the famous line of, you know, and again, this would sound odd a generation or two after Jefferson, but Jefferson, the idea that, well, Europeans and Native Americans will blend. Yeah. Our blood will run in each other's veins. Yeah. But people of African descent, that's an impossibility. Yeah. And so you have, you know, these are all these early theories of race. But then even, you know, and this is, you know, going back to people's, you know, history within, you know, their own K through 12. And I think it's changing nowadays, but the idea that Haitian Revolution, because, like, we always learn about the American Revolution in French, but the Haitian Revolution sort of is this kind of submerged, no one wants to talk about it. It's only been, you know, last 20, 30 years, people are beginning to incorporate it into sort of standard world history, you know, classes. But that was the true Enlightenment revolution. It attacked slavery, pure freedom, you know, and it really messed.
Treat people as equals.
Yeah, well, it really messed with the ideas of this elite thinking, because how did these enslaved people organize a revolution against various armies from different European powers? And you have that shift too, because, you know, we were talking earlier about at what point did Kant begin to switch gears? Because there's always the argument that, you know, slavery is awful and it should be never done, but it's directed towards the moral community of other Europeans. Sure. So Europeans, it's a horror, nightmare of Europeans becoming enslaved. Yeah. But there are natural slaves out there that's completely fine. Yeah.
This is one of the controversy about like Kant's sort of final remarks. This is like, there's some people that think, you know, in the last years of his life, so a lot of these things were written like 1790, so it's like 15 years before he dies. But, you know, the stuff on race that he wrote was like 1777, I think, something like that. Yeah. And so that's like, there's some time in between both of these things, right? And there are people who say, look, Kant changed his mind. about the nature of race. He changed his mind about the applicability of slavery. And you can see it in these remarks and this discussion of colonialism and stuff. And then there are other people who disagree, who say, well, Kant still had all kinds of, deep kind of implicit kinds of racism and attitudes about these things. And here's like how we're going to parse the text to explain why I'm right or you're not, right? Or whatever. Yeah. So there is scholarly controversy about it. There's no question. I think that part of the question maybe is just like, how much did his thinking change, if at all, and how extensive was it? Right?
Yeah.
And it may be that he just like, maybe he was convinced of something, or maybe, I don't know. It's always hard to psychologize people. Like, what was their intention when they were writing this or something?
Well, I think a lot of it is just there's some things that are impossible to think at a certain point in time.
Yeah.
And I think I always think of Europeans entering the 1800s. You have, from the 1500s on, you have layer upon layer of I don't say scholarship, but information from around the world, track records of conquering, wealth coming in through colonialism, slavery, commodity revolutions, and it's on a racialized hierarchy because of colonialism. So you're going into a country. India doesn't come to England and invade and then colonize.
That's right.
England goes to India and colonizes, and eventually, through industrial revolution, industrial weaponry, all that kind of stuff, gets the upper hand.
Yeah.
And the sort of, it often comes down to you better be able to rationalize your cruelty, or else it's going to be hard to go to bed each night and like, oh wait, I got to pray first, and then you're going to pray to God, and then all of a sudden the next day you're doing crimes against humanity. So it's like there's
even this huge. I was thinking about this. This is obviously a little of a different point in history, but even thinking about how like you have these Islamic caliphates that just start gobbling up territories, and at some point, are in charge of huge swaths of the world, and then that recedes or things get picked off or whatever. And presumably the justification is going to be, well, this is kind of what God wanted, or this is why it's okay for us to treat these people this way. And in the context of like European expansion and stuff, I think we see more of that and see more of the causal effects. It lasted longer. It was
it's different too. I think the big thing is it turns into, and this goes back to our discussion that's not on this podcast, but Descartes, the functionalizing of these relationships, where the European expansion is based off investments, right? Like the British East India Company, the Royal Africa Company, the Virginia Company, right? That goes into, was it Jamestown?
Okay.
Right. I always want to say Jonestown. That's a different part.
That's right.
Different part of history. But these are business ventures, right? Spanish, Portuguese, it might be a bit different, but arguably those are sort of medieval institutions moving into the modern world. But by the time the British and the Dutch and the French, these are companies, these are investments. So it's, I think the relationships, the colonialism and slavery, those relationships are entered, and those power relationships are based off, capitalism. Like it's just, it's economic first. And then it becomes cultural,
cultural, religious.
Because you have to interpret it in some way. You have to make sense of what's happening and why. And I think that's the part of when we think of what was going through the mind of Kant or Jefferson, right? Like Jefferson, the other famous line is, if there is a God, we will be punished for what we've done. Which is what? Like, you're now saying that. So basically at the end of as you're getting towards the end of your life, you understand that what you have done is so beyond the pale that God will go out of their way to do some serious punishment upon thee. That's, to me, is really telling. And again, it's like it's people are trapped inside impossible thoughts, right? I think that's the biggest thing is if there's not language to describe something, or a concept, it's impossible, even though it might exist.
Yeah, that's good.
You're trapped in the language of your own time.
That's right. Yeah. So one way we can relate this, that is obviously very directly relevant to the stuff that we've been talking about in our course. But another way I want to encourage you, if like you're new to philosophy, if you're new to like thinking about some of the stuff, or new to this like level of detail in history, which for me, like I'm new to that, right? And so I think like it's helpful to maybe even think about it on that way, right? Which is you're kind of getting a new vocabulary and a new way of conceptual mapping and a way of kind of divvying up situations, hopefully for the better, right? Hopefully it isn't just all useless, logic chopping and distinction making, right? But hopefully it lets you have like some more like nuance and flexibility with which to bring to, ethical analysis, both of our game, Red Dead Redemption 2, and sort of the matters of history and, your own life. So a thing we will come back to again and again in this course is the idea of the scope of the moral community, partly because there are just so many failures of that application, right? Or injustices or horrific things that result from this concept being applied in different ways. And also we will go back to it again and again because it is it's one of the things that we think about in all of these different ethical theories. It's like, to use a really silly example, we are recording this on a computer right now. It's on top of a table. And, if we destroyed this table, there might be legal repercussions. Maybe it'd be foolish. We'd have to pay some money. We wouldn't have something to set stuff up on. But we wouldn't have like deeply wronged the table because we don't think the table is a bearer of rights or possesses moral value, whatever. So we recognize that in our environment, in the world, in reality, there's lots of things we can interact with where doing almost whatever we want is morally permissible in those cases, right? But the question is, where does that stop? And what responsibilities do we have to other people, to the environment, to animals, to people outside of our community, outside of our family, people of different ethnicity or race or sex or gender? All of those things, right? People in comatose states or persistent vegetative states or traumatic brain injuries or really severe developmental disabilities. Like all of these questions are questions about the scope of the moral community and how we should treat other people, how we should treat other living things, how we should treat the environment. All of that is bound up in this discussion of the scope of the moral community. So we hope that you've enjoyed reading along with us and learning along with us thus far. And we hope that you're, enjoying the game. So we will see you next week. You'll hear from us next week. And I don't know.
Yeah. Have a good week.
Yeah.